In time of the Gaza war, many rabbis distributed some verses from the Torah urging the soldiers to kill the Palestinians. This was published in some of the newspaper. I guess it was in Islam Online newspaper. And also there's another thing. It's in McKelthy newspapers about killing the Gentiles, which is the Palestinians. So there is something even before the war. It has to do with the Israeli dogmatic war. They don't want the Palestinians to exist. And this was so clear in Lieberman's declarations all the time. We should get rid of the Palestinians. We should throw them all in the sea. I'd
just like to bring some of the audience. A gentleman in the front row with his hand up. Yeah.
Yes, the gentleman on your left gave a quote now, but does that justify the ratio of 5 Israeli soldiers to 1,300 civilian Palestinians?
That's what President Carter was getting at, wasn't it? It was the disparity of civilian deaths to Israeli forces. It's not like two armies at war.
You know, I wish I could answer this in half a sentence. It may actually take 2 sentences to get this answer out. First of all, they weren't 1,300 civilian deaths. There were 1,300 deaths. There's a difference. Israel disputes how many were civilians and how many were actually armed Hamas fighters.
Well, I think it was 1,457 according to
the numbers are disputed how many were fighters. But the more important point is, when a country goes to war, here people talk about disproportionality, right? The Israelis killed too many Palestinians. Maybe if 1,000 Israelis had died, you wouldn't be raising this. Or maybe if they'd only killed 5 Palestinians, it would seem fairer. But the reality is in warfare, that's not what happens. And some of us are old enough to remember vaguely the Second World War. Remember what Britain did in the Second World War. At the end of the war, when Germany was defeated, and Germany had no air defenses left, the Luftwaffe didn't exist anymore. And when Germany's last kind of throw of the dice was to fire these V-1 and V-2 rockets, which killed very, very few people in Britain, were ineffective weapons. And the British response was to level, flatten German cities like Dresden, which the Germans thought was a war crime because they're killing civilians in their tens of thousands. The British killed more people in an hour in Dresden and Hamburg than Israel's killed in all its wars with the Arabs. And they were civilians. They were targeting civilians. That was disproportionate response, and that's not a war crime.
You're urging the Israelis to kill more Palestinians.
This program doesn't go on for 4 days, otherwise we'd be back to what the Romans did on the British invasion.
But I think that is a relevant point, because it's now consensus in legal opinion that Britain's actions in the Second World War in aerial bombing would now amount to a war crime were it to take place now. I think it makes the point that times have changed, international norms and legal norms have changed, and the kind of disproportionate action against civilian populations that we did see in the Second World War are not acceptable now in international legal opinion.
I'd like to bring in Ashley Hoss, who's got an interesting question, I think, to take this forward. Ashley.
Yeah, does the lack of action in this report prove that the UN is toothless?
Yeah, I mean, is the UN toothless? I mean, I feel you're a lawyer. I mean, is this? I mean, you've mentioned earlier it's not going in because the Americans won't let it. But I mean, is it just going to sit on a shelf in the UN now? Is that the end of it?
I don't think so. I don't think we've seen the end of this report. But I think that the drafters of this report were fairly realistic in their expectations, and I think the hope was that this would concentrate minds on both sides on the seriousness of what's happened and the need to continue in finding a resolution. I don't think it's realistic to think there will be war crimes tribunals, whether ad hoc tribunals or referrals to the ICC. I think that's very unlikely. But I think there's something in between that happening, international criminal trials, and it being a complete waste of time and toothless. I think there's a middle ground where it could have some constructive effect. And I think that's the reality. The UN is not toothless, but it's not as effective as I would like it to be.
It's effective, but when it comes to Sudan and other countries, and we've seen what is happening with the Omar al-Bashir, because he's not in the ally of Americans, he's being brought to justice, and they're asking him to come to justice.
Yeah,
but Israel would never be. But there is a memorandum against him to bring him. But Israel would never.
Have no effect.
Is the UN going to be harmed by this, do you think, Richard, if this report just sits on a shelf in New York?
Unfortunately, it isn't, because the UN has become a toothless watchdog, sadly, because of all the internal politics there. The Security Council is dominated by a small group of nations, and that needs to be widened out. And the General Assembly, as we all know, can't be anything but a talking shop, because there's so many countries there, and they all give predictable replies. So what I'm asking for is try and break out of the predictable mould. I think the UN's, very sadly, it's very difficult for the UN to do anything. Kofi Annan actually tried to get a peacekeeping force rather than just ad hoc forces for the UN, to be able to get peacekeeping forces that it could have on permanent hold so it can actually use them when they need them, and he couldn't even get that out of the UN.
Philip Aller, that sort of takes us on a bit. Would you like to put your question?
Yes. Independently, what we think there might be flaws in the commissioning of the report, or there's this whole sort of political ballet of cross alliances and interests that's preventing or that's going to move forward the report. Today, what mechanisms are there to bring perpetrators of human crimes against humanity, such as we have seen in Africa, such as we will unfortunately see again, such as we have seen much closer to home in the ex-Yugoslavia? What mechanisms are left to go? And I come from Belgium. We've had for a brief time universal jurisdiction on this matter. There were some Israeli military officers that were advised not to travel to that country, and the following administration, after that enshrined it into law, the next administration, due to diplomatic pressure, cancelled or limited the scope.
Thanks, Philip. Okay. I mean, Eric, you're a journalist and author, as well as obviously having a strong view on this particular issue. But I mean, what is the UN going to do to bring perpetrators, whichever side they're on? I mean, is it just going to remain a toothless body, or is it actually going to have some effect? Breaches of human rights have taken place?
Well, first of all, the Goldstone report is having an effect, it's having a public relations effect. But in terms of the UN actually doing anything, I agree. The UN is unlikely. No one's going to stand trial, neither on the Palestinian side nor the Israeli side, before the ICC. However, on the Israeli side, you're not going to believe this, but there are in fact 20 investigations taking place within Israel. Israel does have a legal system just as good as the one you have here in the UK, just as fair and as unfair. And there are Israelis who are being investigated, and in the past there have been many cases of Israelis who've gone on trial, Israeli soldiers, and who've been punished. Israel is a democracy. It is a democracy. It has a rule of law.
So you think people
have you made a trial for Ishaq Shamir, who killed the Court Bernadotte long ago? I wonder if there is good courts in Israel.
For what?
He killed the Court Bernadotte, Ishaq Shamir.
Count Bernadotte.
Yeah.
I think,
and no one brought him to justice. He was a prime minister.
Just to come back to the question, the question was not only about how the UN will respond, but whether there are other ways perpetrators could be brought to justice. Universal jurisdiction, you mentioned, is an interesting development. It allows countries that have nothing to do with a conflict or an alleged crime to try people. So we have universal jurisdiction in this country. That means that somebody who's accused of committing a war crime in another country could be arrested and tried here. That again has largely defaulted into political negotiations, and we had a case in 2005 where an Israeli retired General Almog was almost arrested in this country, but he was tipped off before he got off the plane, so he wasn't. There was a diplomatic spat with Barak recently when there were reports that he might be arrested on an official visit here. Universal jurisdiction is possibly a way that countries will address the inability to have international criminal courts act, but it is very problematic. For one thing, it requires people to travel to the country where they might be arrested, which